Hey, greetings, everybody. Thanks for joining me for this talk on the St. Joseph's Trauma Program. Whether you're doing this voluntarily or you were voluntold to do it, I appreciate you taking the time to learn a little bit more about our trauma program here at St. Joseph's, as well as getting a better understanding for trauma in general and trauma program and systems development. Um, so you work at a trauma center, so I think it's important for all of us to know what that means. And in order to know really what that means, you've got to go back to the beginning and how the systems are set up, and then ultimately how our program feeds into the state of New Jersey trauma systems, and then how our program kind of expands out from there. So, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Steve Wyman. I am with the trauma program here at St. Joseph's, and I run trauma education, injury prevention, community outreach, and EMS outreach. So, it's fantastic that you are joining me for the next 45 minutes to an hour or so. So the objectives for today are pretty straightforward. I want to go over and discuss the components of the New Jersey trauma system. We want to go over the history of trauma systems development and what the role of the American College of Surgeons is in all of that. And I really want you just to come away understanding the role of our trauma program in assuring that optimal care is provided to our trauma patients when they come through our trauma bays, and ultimately go through the flow pattern throughout the hospital and ultimately leading to eventual discharge. All right, so we're going to start off talking about the New Jersey trauma system. I think it's important to kind of again start back and kind of come forward. With when we look at trauma in general, trauma is the leading cause of death for individuals between the ages of 1 and 44 years of age. And that's not something to sneeze at. When we look at it in its totality, it's the number 3 cause of death for all age groups. And that's significant. It's significant for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the mission of what we do here at St. Joe's. Interestingly enough, the majority of trauma-related deaths are hemorrhage-related, and therefore they are deemed to be preventable. And they're preventable from the standpoint of if we can put proper hands on a trauma patient in a very, very timely fashion, and we can slow or stop bleeding, hemorrhaging, we can save lives. And that's a testimony to the system because really, at this point in time, 96% of trauma patients that arrive at trauma centers in the United States survive. And that's really, really good. That's a far better cry than it was even a decade ago when that number was down to closer to about 92%. Now, interestingly enough, for those of you that are old enough to remember this, but prior to about 1976, there was really no national consensus on trauma care in the United States. And it really was the American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma that jumped on board in 1976 and developed the first national guidelines for the care of the trauma patient. And very quickly after that, the state of New Jersey jumped on board, seizing the information that came from the American College of Surgeons and actually put in place a statewide trauma plan, which we continue to use today. But the national guidelines are the guidelines that even till today that we utilize when it comes to running not only the trauma system within the state of New Jersey, but more importantly, how we run our trauma program here at St. Joseph's. This book or this manual that just came up is called Resources for the Optimal Care of the Trauma Patient. And this is also what we call the Gray Book. And the Gray Book really is our Bible. It tells us everything we need to know in order to run not only the trauma system within the state of New Jersey, but more importantly, a trauma center, our trauma program here at St. Joseph's. That's just a QR code if you're interested in downloading this book and reading a little bit about it, which I encourage you to do. You can click on this QR code. It will take you to the American College of Surgeons website, and you can download your own pristine PDF of the resources. And they are all inclusive. It's not just about the pre-hospital setting. It's not just about the emergency department. It's not just about the ORs or the ICUs. It's everybody, including the PACU, the PICU, rehab, um, education for our communities, EMS. I'm sorry, not EMS. Trauma outreach that we do, that I do, is part of my job here at St. Joe's, going out into the community and doing trauma prevention initiatives, injury prevention initiatives. So again, it is an interesting read. Right. So when we kind of look and see what's going on with trauma centers and what are trauma centers and what makes up a trauma center, the American College of Surgeons verifies up to 5 levels of trauma care. And I say it verifies it because ultimately, in most states, the American College of Surgeons is not the regulatory agency behind whether or not you're a trauma center. It is really a state determined decision. And that's the way it is in the state of New Jersey. The state of New Jersey, through a certificate of need program, determines what hospitals may be trauma centers, and usually through a very lengthy application process. It's such a hard thing to do that there hasn't been an additional trauma center added outside of the current 10 trauma centers in well over 2 decades. And the reason for that is because, and we'll talk about it, its population densities and the way the laws are struck for how trauma centers are developed here in New Jersey. But the American College of Surgeons will designate up to 5 levels of trauma care. There's the level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and level 5 trauma centers. Okay. Interestingly enough, in the state of New Jersey, there are only 2 designations of trauma centers that are recognized, and that's the level 1 trauma center and the level 2 trauma center. And we'll talk about the reasons behind that. But just for your own edification, a level 5 trauma center is really a critical access hospital that has limited resources, but it does have a limited emergency department capacity. But their staff are trained at the basics for how to care for the initial presentation of trauma patients. They don't stay there. They don't go to operating rooms there. They're not admitted there. They're typically go in, whatever kind of initial airway, breathing, circulation needs to happen, and then they are transferred out to higher level trauma centers. A level 4 trauma center is really not much more than a step above a level 5. It's probably it's a little bit bigger hospital. It's got a little bit more resources within the emergency department. They can do a little bit higher level initial resuscitation of the trauma patient, but ultimately the vast majority of the trauma patients, anything that's considered a moderate or seriously injured trauma patient, will get transferred out to a higher level trauma center. A level 3 trauma center, again, does have a bit of capacity to it. It does have intensive care unit capacity for trauma patients. It does have operating room capacity, but on a very limited basis and for really only moderately injured patients, whereas more severely injured patients need to be staffed or stabilization or transferred up to a level 1 or a level 2 trauma center. So again, here in the state, we really only recognize level 1 and level 2 trauma centers. And a lot of it is just because of population densities and the size of the state. Now, the trauma system is not just, as I said earlier, it's not just an ambulance, it's not just an emergency department, it's not just an operating room, it's not just a PACU. It is the continuum of care from the time that a patient is injured on the streets to the time they are re-entered into their life. And in each step of the way, just as you've probably seen something very simple when you've taken CPR with the CPR chain of survival, trauma systems operate really on the same, predications of it takes a village. And the village here is really at least a 5-step process that starts ultimately with bystander care. And I mentioned earlier, patients can survive bad injuries, particularly bleeding injuries, if they receive timely care. And sometimes that timely care can be by bystander care, bystanders that come on the scene of a motor vehicle crash, or God forbid, an active shooting, or a building collapse, or even a structure fire where people jump out of windows and put their hands appropriately on those injured people and slow or stop bleeding, move them out of harm's way, things like that. So it's a very critical step, and it's a very recognized step now in trauma care. That's followed by obviously the magnitude of importance that our pre-hospital care providers have with regards to the system, and making sure that our pre-hospital care providers have the proper education and training and competence to care for these injured patients in the field. And there isn't any greater time than now where pre-hospital trauma care absolutely impacts the outcomes on our trauma patients. Then we come to kind of the middle circle here, which is hospital definitive care. That's us. That's what we do. From the time the patient crosses the threshold into the ED, into the trauma resuscitation bay, and then ultimately goes to wherever they're going to go, be it radiology for CAT scan, interventional radiology, the operating room, to you guys afterwards in PACU, to the SICU, to the PICU, or to the med surg units. The care that we provide is obviously the linchpin that stabilizes that patient, and hopefully then allows us to take them on to the next step, which is early rehab, maximizing their return to society, and ultimately return to society, hopefully, as a fully functioning individual. Now, there is a construct that was started back in the 1970s, and that was called the Golden Hour of Care. And the Golden Hour of Care came out of the University of Maryland at this point in time. And the University of Maryland, through some studies that they had been doing and some research they had been doing, kind of came up with the conclusion that if you can get a trauma patient to definitive care within 1 hour of their injury, you will greatly enhance their survivability. But over the years, that's been the research and the constructs behind that have been questioned. And the reality is that really true, or is that maybe not so true? And when we look in the early 1980s, this is a very, very famous graph that was produced and was the fodder of a lot of education at the time, and really up until probably the late 1990s and even the early 2000s, that showed the trimodal distribution of death in the trauma patient. And that trimodal distribution was that there are 3 peaks of death when it comes to dying as a result of trauma. And you could see that the first peak and the biggest peak occurred usually within the construct of that first hour of injury. And that's really where the concept of the golden hour came from. Okay. There was a second spike that happened somewhere between about 2 and 3 hours post arrival to a hospital. And there were a variety of parameters that you can see that are listed there that could have led to that second increase in spike. And then moving down several weeks post arrival into the trauma center, or into the hospital at this time, because these weren't all trauma centers, we saw patients that were dying from things like sepsis, infection, multi-system organ failure, things like that. And that was something that was really, really problematic. But when we also looked at this number a little bit more closely, and we looked at the data, if we look at the peak of this first mode, of this first the first peak, we see this is not happening at the first hour. We see it's really happening within the first 30 minutes. And guess what? Years later, we took a look at the same data that kind of was formulated to create this graph, as well as the golden hour construct. And we came up with kind of something that maybe the golden hour isn't exactly the golden hour. Maybe what we really need to be thinking about is the first 30 minutes of care. And here is a very similar graph that now is translated to 2014. So we're talking about 30, by my math, 30 something years later. And what we see is this. First of all, the distribution of death, particularly that first peak, still remained, but it really remained within the first 30 minutes of care. All right. And then those secondary peaks had kind of gone away because we had evolved our trauma systems to where we were now treating in the hospital those injuries that were predicating these patients to dying. So we were flattening out the curve, but we still had this first peak. And this first peak is really given way to what we now call the platinum 30 minutes, or our ability from the time that a patient is injured on the streets to arrival for definitive care in a trauma center to try to make it 30 minutes or less. And I'll tell you, when we look at our stats here, we do a pretty good job within Passaic County, within Paterson, where a lot of our trauma patients come from, but even in the surrounding areas of getting them here within, 5-10 minutes either side of that 30-minute curve. And again, I think that helps tremendously when it comes to looking at survivability. All right, let's talk a little bit about the trauma system in the state of New Jersey a little bit. So, in the state of New Jersey, as I mentioned, we only have level 1 and we have level 2 trauma centers. And these are equally distributed. It doesn't look so equal when you look at the chart, but they're distributed based on population density. So, we've got 10 trauma centers that are designated in the state of New Jersey. 7 of those are level 2 trauma centers, and 3 of those are level 1 trauma centers. The level 1 trauma centers are distributed between the northern region of the state, the central region of the state. Yes, there is a central New Jersey, and the southern region of the state. Those 3 level 1 trauma centers, as you may know, in the northern region is University Hospital in Newark. In the central portion of the state, it's Robert Wood Johnson in New Brunswick. And in the southern portion of the state, it's Cooper University in Camden. All right. So those are your 3. They called them the anchor hospitals, and they are to an extent anchor hospitals, trauma centers, but really not so much. And you'll see why in a few minutes as we continue to talk here. The other 7 trauma centers are distributed based on population density. And that's why you see 5 of the state's 10 trauma centers situated in kind of the northern tier, and more importantly, almost like the northeastern corner of our state. And the reason for that is about 60% of our population, when these trauma centers were developed, were in this particular geographic area. So that being said, they geared the resources toward that area. Population density is one of the things that's built into the statute that runs trauma centers in the state. So they wanted to make sure that where patients were most likely to be injured, there was an adequate number of trauma centers to meet that demand. And quite honestly, for the most part, this has worked out very well over the years. You can also see that we have got one particular center up here, which is listed, but it's not a trauma center. This is St. Barnabas, or it's Cooperman Barnabas now, in Livingston, and that's actually our state designated burn center. So it's the only burn center in the state of New Jersey. It's not a trauma center, which means almost all trauma patients have to come through trauma centers first to be medically evaluated and make sure they do not have trauma, and not just a single burn. If a patient has an isolated burn injury, then they can be routed directly to Barnabas. But if they've got any kind of trauma, already suspected trauma, then they go to a trauma center first, and then the trauma center evaluates them, treats the underlying injuries as well as the burn, and then transfers, when appropriate, to the burn center. But we've got these trauma centers. They're all state-designated trauma centers, which means you can't be a trauma center in the state of New Jersey unless the state says, you, St. Joseph's University Medical Center in Paterson, you are a trauma center. So once we get the thumbs up from the state that we are a trauma center, we then go and apply to the American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma, and then they have a verification committee that comes in, and then using the tenets of that gray book that I showed you earlier, they come in and grade us on our ability to take care of patients. Do we have all of the proper resources in place? Do we have personnel in place? Do we have systems, processes in place? Is our program run the way it needs to? Do we have a fervent quality improvement program? And it's all about quality improvement with the American College of Surgeons. Are we doing injury prevention initiatives? Do we do research? I mean, a cadre of different things, again, that you can look up in that gray book if you're interested. But we have to get a thumbs up from them. The American College of Surgeons comes in, they give us a thumbs up, they give us a nice little plaque we put on the wall, and then for that period of time, we can be a trauma center. But the trauma center designation is determined by the state, not by the American College of Surgeons. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Again, I mentioned trauma centers are located based on population density. The population densities are switching a little bit. We're seeing more rural population densities increase, and there is some talk at the level of the State Trauma Advisory Council, or what we call the STAC, and I sit on that group, of do we need to, are we at a point now where we need to be considering either an additional or maybe two level two trauma centers in more rural areas that are now increasing in population as our population densities move out of the urban centers and more into the rural highlands? Or do we maybe need a couple level three trauma centers that can at least initially stabilize and then transfer patients? And that's under discussion right now. But at the time being, as we sit here today, there's still 10 trauma centers, three state designated level one, and seven state designated level two. There are no state designated pediatric trauma centers. That's interesting, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Um, and the constructs also were set up where not only there was a population density to consider, but they also wanted to make sure that by helicopter, you were never more than 20 minutes away from a trauma center as well. And that's particularly important for the rural areas of the state. All right, when you get down into Cumberland County or up into Sussex County or Warren County or even far out into Hunterdon County, that you make sure that, you know what, we might not be able to get you by ground to a trauma center within 20 or 30 minutes, but we can put you in a helicopter. And there's a lot of helicopter assets now that fly around the state of New Jersey doing that, that we can get you to a trauma center more quickly when you're kind of rurally encumbered. And then I mentioned the oversight ultimately of the trauma process, and the group that kind of looks at the trauma system and makes recommendations for change is the STAC, the State Trauma Advisory Council. All trauma centers have a representative, as well as a bunch of professional organizations, and even the lay public has a seat on this council. All right. So, what is a level one trauma center? So, a level one trauma center is, generally speaking, in the eyes of the American College of Surgeons, is a trauma center that's able to provide systematic leadership. I mentioned those anchor level one trauma centers. So they not only serve not only as the highest level, highest echelon of trauma clinical care, but they also are leadership hospitals. They are supposed to actually lead the way and kind of be the big brother to all of the other level two trauma centers, and even non-trauma centers that are out there. In its central role, they have to be able to provide essentially a comprehensive trauma care to all comers of trauma. They generally are university-based teaching hospitals. They have to be able to demonstrate, obviously, patient care. They have to be able to demonstrate education, continuing education of staff, education of future healthcare professionals, education of pre-hospital providers, and education of the public, as well as doing research. All right. And that's really, really important. They also are very involved in anchoring regional disaster planning, the ability to increase capacity for surge capacity, and as I mentioned earlier, doing a tremendous amount of research, which helps to shape and evolve our trauma system. A level two trauma center needs to be able to provide initial definitive care to a wide range of injuries and injury severity. They take on additional responsibilities of in their particular region of being able to do education, leadership, disaster planning, and community outreach. So really, they're just in the eyes of the American College of Surgeons, they're really just one minor step below that of a level one center. They do not have to be university affiliated. They don't have to be teaching hospitals. They could be community hospitals, so long as they have the proper resources to be able to put up to be level two trauma centers. That's what the college is really looking at. So really, what differentiates a level one and a level two trauma center? Well, it really varies widely. In the state of New Jersey, I'm happy to say not a lot. All right. It's very different if you were to go to other parts of the country, the Midwest, where I was for a long time in like Missouri or Illinois or Iowa and Nebraska. It's very different, the differentiation between a level one and a level two trauma center there. In New Jersey, it's not. In fact, most of the state designated level two trauma centers operate at a level that meets level one criteria. Almost all have academic affiliation. Even we at St. Joe's have academic affiliation. We don't have a singular academic affiliation, but we have multiple affiliations. All right. A level one trauma center must see a high number of trauma patients annually, more than 1,200 trauma patients. And not only is it not only is it a volume of patients they need to see, but they also need to see patients that are moderately to seriously injured. And that's defined as an injury severity score greater than 15. And they have to see somewhere around about 240 or more of these more seriously injured patients. Okay. A level one trauma center must have a surgical critical care residency program. They must have a surgical critical care capacity. They must have an active operating room system and appropriate PACU facilities post care or post operative care. They should have a trauma research program, as I mentioned before, and be doing trauma education. And those are main indicators, again, that do differentiate them. And as I said, most of the trauma centers in New Jersey meet that level one criteria, and that includes us here at St. Joseph. Okay. So, really, for all intents and purposes, even though we can only call ourselves level two trauma center, we really do operate at a level one capacity. Very rarely do we have to transfer patients out of St. Joe's because we don't have the ability to care for the complexity of the injuries they have. And most of these are really bad orthopedic injuries. They may be bad pediatric trauma because we do have good pediatric capacity here, but we don't have fervent pediatric trauma accessibility like some hospitals do. The higher level, the level one trauma centers do, the anchor hospitals. But we do. We really do meet most of these criteria, and we have extraordinarily positive programs within St. Joseph's, which is great. So here's a good question for you. In New Jersey, you're your state designated level two trauma center, but can you become verified by the American College of Surgeons at a level higher than the state designates you at? Now, some people will be going, no, you can't because the state has designated you to be a level two. So the college needs to designate you at a level two. But that is not true. The reality is that even though we are a state designated level two trauma center, we can, if we choose to, and trauma centers do this, choose to be verified at a level higher. So obviously, if you're a level one trauma center or state designated level one, you have to be designated at a level one. But since we also have, again, 7 level two trauma centers, those trauma centers can, of their own accord, elect to be verified as level one trauma centers. Now, in the eyes of the state, they still can only advertise themselves as level two trauma centers, but they still do carry the certificate, and they can, in advertising, state that they are credentialed by the American College of Surgeons as a level one trauma center. And we do have some hospitals in the state that have done that, rightly so. Right now, we got Morristown that has done it. We've got Hackensack just up the road here. Jersey Shore has done it. And, question is, what about St. Joe's? Right now, 3 of the 7 trauma centers in the state have gone out and they've kind of done the additional steps to become verified as a level one trauma center. And we've discussed it within our trauma program here. A lot of it just comes down to finances. All right. We're doing a yeoman's job right now. We're treating 99% of our patients that come through. We're transferring very few. When you separate burns out, we're transferring very few patients out over the course of a year. If you recall, when I showed you the level one criteria, you have to see greater than 1,200 patients. Our trauma registry has recorded a little shy of 2,000 patients. And of the 240 mark that they have to be moderately severely injured, we certainly meet that threshold. So certainly we're there, but a lot of it is the finances that then come around to making sure that you're solidly in the square with the American College of Surgeons. And as like all facilities, and as particularly an underserved the underserved community, and our mission as an institution, at this point in time, we think maybe the monies are better spent elsewhere. Doesn't mean we won't eventually go in that direction. I do believe we will at some point in time. But as of right now, we stay pat with the American College of Surgeons as a level 2 trauma center. It doesn't really do anything for anybody. We're not going to get an increase in the number of trauma patients that we see at this point in time or anything like that by going on and becoming a college designated level 1, but still a state designated level 2. So just so you know that. And if you ever were to see some of the advertisements for Jersey Shore, Hackensack, Morristown, where they do talk about themselves being a level one trauma center. That's because they've gone on and done the college level one, and they're still state designated level two trauma centers. Okay. I mentioned earlier that the state does not designate pediatric trauma centers. So the reality behind that is that, yes, every trauma center in the state of New Jersey has to have the ability to be able to care for pediatric trauma patients. And the reason we don't have level, and we have no level, we would never have level one trauma centers yet for pediatrics, although I'm going to contradict myself there in a second, is that we just, most hospitals don't have a tremendous pediatric volume. You have to see greater than 200 pediatric patients a year that meet kind of predetermined trauma activation criteria in order to be a level one pediatric center in the eyes of the American College of Surgeons. In order to be a level two trauma center, you have to see greater than 100 patients per year. So a lot of the trauma centers don't see they don't see greater than 200 patients. So they don't quite meet the threshold criteria. Although there is one now in the state that does meet that criteria and has been designated actually as a level one pediatric trauma center. So we'll talk about that in a second. But all trauma centers have to have the capacity to take care of patients. If you do not have a pediatric ICU, then once you do initial resuscitation, and if you do operative care, if it needs to be done urgently, then they get transferred up to a pediatric intensivist center that has a pediatric ICU. We do have a pediatric ICU here. It's a very good pediatric ICU, as you all know. And so we do certainly meet, again, all of the criteria that we would need to become if we chose to do so, a level two pediatric center, again, in the eyes of the college, but not in the eyes of the state. So right now, there are 5 trauma centers in the state that are American College of Surgeons pediatric certified trauma centers. 4 of them at the level 2 level, 1 of them at the level 1 level. So University in Newark, Robert Wood Johnson, New Brunswick, Cooper, and Camden. So the 3 anchor hospitals or level 1 trauma centers are all level 2 pediatric trauma centers. Hackensack, just up the road from us, is a level 2 pediatric trauma center by the American College of Surgeons. And Jersey Shore just became, I believe, a level 1 pediatric trauma center. They got, you can imagine, during the summer months, they just get lamb blasted down there with kids. So they just certainly meet the criteria. So we do have we do have college designated level 2 and a level 1 pediatric trauma center. But again, in the eyes of the state, all trauma centers should be able to take care of pediatric patients with appropriate transfer protocols in place for those trauma patients that exceed our capacity or capabilities for care. All right, so that is the trauma system globally within the state of New Jersey. Let's now hone down and let's chat a little bit about St. Joseph's Trauma Program. As I mentioned, we are a level 2 adult trauma center. We are a regional trauma center, so we do have not so much a defined catchment area, but we do have a designated catchment area for patients. Our trauma program is made up of a multitude of people, and many of these are people behind the scenes and you don't know about, but it's important because A, they have to be there as per the gray book, but also they are the staples that make sure the trauma program works, that make sure that we are meeting all of the criteria that we need to meet in order to maintain our level 2 trauma designation. And again, making sure that care is appropriate, and if care is deviated, shouldn't say deviated, that appropriate quality assurance measures are put in place, performance improvement measures are put in place. And that, again, education is done, that we serve the community, and that we make sure that we have great functioning clinical staff. So you see, we have a trauma medical director here. That's Ben Rabine. He's the chief of the division of trauma, and he's our trauma medical director. Our trauma program manager is Jeannie Keneally. We have an administrative assistant, that's Sean Goldbach. We have 2 performance improvement coordinators, Eva Rojas and Elmer Abraham. We have an injury prevention coordinator, me. We have a trauma social worker, which is Lucia Jimenez. We have 9 trauma surgeons, soon to be 10 trauma surgeons. And then we have 3 designated trauma advanced practice nurses. And we have a designated trauma critical care APN as well. So we do have a very, very great program, a very robust program when it comes to our staff here, doing everything that we need to do under the guise of that gray book to make sure that our trauma system, our trauma program is exactly where it needs to be. Okay. And certainly what you're doing today by sitting through and listening to this program and maintaining your verification of your 4 continuing education hours per year of trauma education, that is one of the trauma program criteria that we have set up through the American College of Surgeons that we need to have in order again to maintain our credential. I mentioned about trauma center verification. Again, it's through the American College of Surgeons, the Committee on Trauma, and they have what's called a VRC, or a Verification Review Committee. And just like DMV and just like any of the other requisite regulators, although they're technically quasi-regulatory because they don't have any statutory authority per se to do what they do. It's really the process by which we need to become verified in order through the state statute to be, again, a trauma center. They come out, they do a virtual now inspection of our system, and it's a 2 day, or it's a day and a half um, um, system where they go through and they look at medical records and they talk about our quality improvement system, our performance improvement system. They look at all of the different components of our program. They ask questions to make sure that all of our continuing education is up to date, all of our nursing staff and physician staff and other clinical staff members have the right qualifications to do the job, things like that. They do come every 3 years. And again, we must be verified by the American College of Surgeons to maintain our status as a state trauma center. All right. Now, what does it mean when we talk about trauma patients coming in and determining what patients are trauma patients and what patients are not trauma patients? How is that ultimately determined? All right. Well, we have a really good system here now in New Jersey that's evolved over the last couple of years that starts at the pre-hospital level. That for us in particular here at St. Joseph's, we allow and encourage our pre-hospital colleagues to activate the trauma team from the field. So they have a set of defined criteria, which comes out through the Department of Health Office of Emergency Medical Services that they have to follow, that looks at red box criteria and yellow box criteria. And these are injury patterns, they are physiologic criteria, their mechanism of injury criteria, and then their own clinician intuition and judgment. And they can, from either of the red box or the yellow box, choose to activate either a red trauma or a yellow trauma from the field. So if a EMS agency gets on scene and they've determined they've got a patient who's sufficiently injured and seriously injured enough to be considered a red box criteria, they can then call into the hospital and say, we are en route with you with a trauma red. And then we know that that's going to be a moderate to seriously injured patient. Okay. Or they may meet the criteria of everything listed under the yellow boxes. And if that's the case, they may call it as a trauma yellow, which we would then aptly activate our internal trauma team for a more moderately injured patient that could be coming in, but knowing that at any point in time we may have to upgrade. And we'll talk about what that means in a minute. So we do rely on activation from the field. We encourage activation from the field. And the reason we encourage that is it takes time for us to get the trauma team together, to get down into the trauma bay and be ready to receive the patient. And if we only receive no notification, or we only receive notification of 3 minutes out or 4 minutes out, then by the time the call comes in, it gets taken by either the medical control physician or the charge nurse in the emergency department. They contact telecommunications to put out the pages and the email messages and the text messages, which takes anywhere from about 5 to 7 minutes. By the time the trauma team in its entirety assembles in the trauma bay, the patient may already be here. And we don't like that. We like to have the entire trauma team here, ready to meet the patient when they come through that door. Doesn't work that way all of the time, but we're finding more times than not, somewhere around 60 to about 70% of the time, that's happening, which is far better than it was a couple of years ago. And we still have some work to go, but it is far better than it used to be. All of the EMS agencies that I can get my hands on have been educated on trauma triage and the red trauma, yellow trauma system, which is a statewide system now in New Jersey. And they were given badge buddies, and this is just a snippet off of the badge buddy that they have to carry on them as a reference with the trauma notification phone number. So they can pick up the phone and they can call our charge nurse and let him or her know we have got a trauma patient coming in. And then internally, we have trauma team activation criteria, which closely, not 100%, but very closely mimic the red trauma, yellow trauma that you saw in the previous graphic. And they are coded red and yellow as well, but we don't call them red trauma and yellow trauma, although I don't think we should. But anyway, we call them either a trauma code, which is our highest level of trauma team activation, or our secondary trauma team activation criteria is a trauma alert. Really, for all intents and purposes, the difference in personnel that get dispatched down to the trauma bays when a trauma code is called versus a trauma alert really is about the same. The only true differentiation is for a trauma code. Anesthesia gets notified. They in turn notify the operating room. And then the blood bank will send blood products down to the resuscitation bay. For a trauma alert, we don't have anesthesia notified. We don't have the blood bank notified, but the remainder of the trauma team is notified. Nursing staff, physician staff, residents, respiratory therapy, x-ray, things like that. And again, the goal is that we want to have as many of these individuals in the trauma bay as possible when the patient arrives. Now, every once in a while, we get a pediatric trauma patient, about 104 of them, I believe, in 2024. A pediatric patient, as defined by the American College of Surgeons, is typically between the ages of birth and 15 years of age. Their activation criteria for a trauma code, a trauma code or a trauma alert are fairly much the same. There are a little bit of differences because of the nuances in the physiology of the pediatric patient, but really, if you were to do a side-by-side comparison, the code and the alert criteria pretty much line up. And again, the difference with a pediatric trauma alert and code will be it evokes a pediatric nurse from the PEDS emergency department, as well as a pediatric attending to come into the trauma bay. And they supplant the adult physician and nurse with regards to caring for the pediatric patient when they come in. And then we also now have what we call a Jerry alert. Now, a Jerry alert is not a trauma team activation, but what it is, it's a special program in the emergency department. When people come in ages 65 or more and they meet certain criteria, certain triage criteria, they get pushed to the head of the line. All right. They get pushed to the head of the line if they are a 65-year-old that falls and hits their head, has a loss of consciousness, or a 69-year-old who falls on anticoagulants and hits their head and is not acting 100% right, things like that. Or a 72-year-old who falls, hits head, and is on some kind of, again, an anticoagulant. These are things that when on triage, the attention is to prioritize that patient for initial screening by physician or APN staff, and then ultimately get any diagnostics underway very, very quickly to determine or rule out serious injuries. If at any point in time it's decided that these individuals need to be seen by the trauma program, if they're not seriously injured, then they'll be made trauma consults, which is our lowest level of trauma team activation, which really isn't a trauma team activation. It just has a patient in the emergency room in one of the ED proper rooms, and then a surgical resident and ultimately an attending have a time limitations on coming down and evaluating them and determining their disposition. But this is something that's great. It's particularly the Jerry alert has really cut down on the number of geriatric patients that come in with seemingly minor injuries, at least at triage, but end up having something a little more egregious that isn't caught. And what's also interesting to know is a lot of our trauma patients don't necessarily come by ambulance. 60% of our penetrating patients come by the front door, come through private means, POV as we call them, private vehicles, and about 10% of our blunt trauma too. So we have to have obviously highly attuned triage nurses that when these patients come in, they are screening, triaging, and then activating as appropriate. All right, our trauma volume. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a pretty significant trauma volume that comes in here. We see somewhere around 2,000 trauma patients a year, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but fairly stabilized at around that number. About 60% of them, or 59% exactly, are adults. So they're between the ages of 15 and 64 years of age. Okay. We do see about 6% of our trauma patient population are those individuals that are pediatric patients, again, between the ages of birth and 15. And then about 35% of our trauma patients are older adults. So they are patients that come in greater than 65. When we look at our mechanisms of injury, the top three are falls, and that is true for every emergency department in the country and every trauma center in the country. Falls is the number one mechanism of injury for our trauma patients. In our particular center, our particular program, it's followed by motor vehicle related incidents, which could be motor vehicle crashes, motorcycle crashes, motorbike crashes, or pedestrian struck. And penetrating trauma, we see somewhere around 12 to about 13% of our trauma is penetrating trauma, which is far lower than it used to be going back about 4 years. That was probably closer to about 20 to 25%. So, through injury prevention initiatives and through our hospital linked violence intervention program called the Paterson Healing Collective, which is a grant funded group of violence interventionalists that work in the communities and work with us in the emergency department and the trauma program to slow and stem the tide of violence that will result in not only assaults, but also penetrating injuries, particularly gunshot wounds and knifings, has done a yeoman's job over the last 4 years and has cut our penetrating trauma in half, which is great. So certainly accolades to our colleagues at the Paterson Healing Collective. And our trauma patients come from a variety of places. About a little more than half, about 61% are Passaic County residents, but 21% come outside Passaic County. And that's because our catchment area includes parts of Bergen County, Essex County, Morris County, Sussex County as well. And about 18% are non-specified. So they're probably outside of Passaic County. Every once in a while, again, there are people that are traveling down I-80 or the Turnpike or the Parkway maybe that are closer and are from out of state. But you see, it's not everybody is a Paterson resident, contrary to sometimes what we think about our trauma patients, and not all of them certainly live within Passaic County. And I mentioned our trauma volume. Again, blunt mechanism of injury is our number one mechanism of injury, penetrating about 12 to 14%, which is really in check and balance with all of the urbanized trauma centers in the state. That we've seen, fortunately, a decrease in our penetrating trauma, but still pretty high. The national average is somewhere around 4 to about 6%. So we're still seeing double the national average for trauma centers, but we are also urban environments, so that's to be expected. I mentioned about pre-arrival notification and how important it was. And again, we keep track of that within our trauma program. And we're between about 60 and 80% of the time we're getting some level of pre-arrival notification from our pre-hospital colleagues, which is phenomenal. And again, it allows us to have our trauma team up and ready to go. Let's talk very quickly about the pre-hospital landscape, because again, I mentioned as part of the chain of survival, if you will, pre-hospital care is extremely important. In the state of New Jersey, we have basically three components to our pre-hospital landscape. We have a basic life support system, we have the advanced trauma life support system, our advanced life support system, and then I have an aeromedical system, which is advanced life support. The vast majority of the pre-hospital care that is provided in New Jersey is at the basic life support level. These are EMT certified individuals that are responsible for providing basic to moderate interventions for patients that are injured. About 65 to 70% of our basic life support programs in New Jersey are volunteer in nature. So we are dealing with a large volunteer base when it comes to EMS at the basic level. Advanced life support are the paramedics and pre-hospital nurses. These are individuals, again, that have the ability to literally take the emergency departments to the field. They're also called mobile intensive care programs because, again, they are able to provide that higher echelon of care, certainly above what that can be done by our basic life support colleagues. They in the field can, in addition to giving medications, can also give fluids. They can do invasive ventilatory support, such as intubation, rapid sequence intubation, and ventilatory support. And more recently, they have now been given the ability to carry blood and blood products on the ambulances as well. So that will be, I think, a deal changer. I'm sorry, that will be a systems changer when we finally get all of that implemented. And then there's the aeromedical group. That's the helicopter. That's the nurses and the medics that are on the helicopter programs that are throughout the state and that bring us trauma patients from the more rural areas of the state. So any of those can certainly bring us patients. I'd say probably about 5% of the time it's aeromedical, and the other 95% of the time, probably at least half and half, it's split between a basic life support only crew that comes in, or a combined basic life support and advanced life support unit. The other thing that's interesting about the state of New Jersey is that generally the advanced life support are not ambulance-based clinicians. They drive around essentially in chase vehicles or fly vehicles with their equipment on them, and they meet up with a basic life support team, and then they work in combination as a team to then provide care, then under the direction of the paramedics and transport of patients to the hospital. And then what's extremely important is making sure that when our pre-hospital colleagues arrive, be they BLS, ALS, or aeromedical, that they provide good information, solid information, consistently heard information to the members of the trauma team when they are handing off their care from the pre-hospital environment to us. So let's take a look at the way this should work. We're going to get the patient in, we're going to get them situated, but before the patient is moved, we get a report.
Before we move the patient on the bed, we need to stop for a report.
She's 22, coming from Apple Valley. So for EMS, she was actually riding a quad. She was non-helmeted, lost control of the quad. About 30, 35 miles an hour, ended up end over end. So she landed on her face. Positive loss of consciousness. She's got a significant amount of swelling to her right side, unable to open her right pupil, her right eye. Also unable to really open her mouth to really assess her dentation. But she's been alert. Per EMS, she did have a positive LOC. She was out for approximately 1 minute.
Okay.
She had 2 episodes of that. She does have some ETOH on board. She's able to maintain her airway. She does have some abrasions to her chest and right arm, but everything else is unremarkable. Stable pelvis, belly's been soft, cloud pulse with equal to palpation. Sugar was 111. She's got 2 IVs, 220 gauges for you guys, and no history of meds, allergies. So
What was her last blood pressure about?
141/77.
Was she tacky at all?
Nope, not tacky
Okay.
at all. Yeah.
So there's an initial loss of consciousness, and then they said that there's another loss of
Yeah,
consciousness.
so she had a total of 2, and each time lasting about a minute.
And this is so during your guys' transport?
No, she's been alert for us.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So no complaint of pain upon palpation to the pelvis or anything like that. So
Okay.
Any other questions?
No. 1, 2, 3.
This IV came out over here. Okay.
All right, so basically what you saw is what we like to do in our trauma base is called the missed handoff. And basically what that is that as our pre-hospital colleagues come in with the patient on the stretcher, regardless of how critical that patient is, we take a quick 60-second pause before we transition the patient from the EMS stretcher to our trauma bay bed to get a quick 60 to 90-second report from the lead EMS clinician, be that either a paramedic, a pre-hospital nurse, or an EMT. And they go through, as you can see over to the right, this trauma timeout criteria. This is the flip side of that red and yellow trauma criteria card that I showed you earlier that we give all of our pre-hospital colleagues to carry with them. And they go through the missed handoff. And the missed handoff goes with where they tell us about the mechanism of injury, the injuries that they found on their pre-hospital assessment, symptoms and vital signs, and any treatment they did prior to arrival, and then any other additional information, such as past medical history, meds, allergies, things like that. And it allows us also to get some questions, as you saw, from the members of the trauma team, so they can fill in any links. The key here is that everyone in the room is quiet, everyone is paying attention to the report being given and the interaction between the trauma team leader and the EMS lead clinician. So we're all hearing the same information at the same time, and we have an opportunity to ask very quickly questions before we get into the organized chaos that can be a trauma resuscitation. We are a leader in this. We were one of the first trauma centers in the state to mandate the trauma timeout, and slowly but surely, trauma center or trauma bays across the state are now doing this, and it's probably more prevalent now than not for most of the trauma centers. And once the patient comes and is transitioned into the trauma bay, these are posters that are put up in all of our trauma bays. And the trauma bay basically it's a blueprint of where people need to be standing when the patient comes in. And then those are tied into a manual that we call our trauma manual, which goes over roles and responsibilities of somebody working in the resuscitation bay. We've got a lot of people that are gathered around. If you've ever been down to the trauma bay, you'll notice that there are red lines that are stretched around each of the trauma beds. Those are demarcation areas between those individuals, the clinicians that are working on the patient, versus those that don't need to be in the room or not working on the patient. They need to stay behind the red line to give our clinicians that are working on the patient the elbow room that they need in order to care for the patient. And it also goes into the legend about the different people that are literally in that trauma bay or tangential to that trauma bay from the time the patient arrives until the time they leave. The trauma bay gets cleaned up and we get ready for the next trauma to come in. The other edict that we have within our trauma bay is that we want the patient in and out of that trauma bay within 30 minutes or less. Okay. The logic is that we are going to treat seriously injured patients very quickly. If the patients need operative intervention, then that decision needs to be made very quickly. If the patient needs to go to radiology and they're otherwise stable, that decision is made very quickly. And then ultimately, if the patient doesn't need radiologic procedures, which is pretty rare, then we can disposition them out into the emergency department pending their final disposition. And that's what it's all about. What's the disposition? And it is multifaceted. So trauma flow, once the patient is evaluated and once the patient is initially treated, can go, through a variety of different pathways. One would be, and the most likely one is to go to the CAT scanner, right? We CAT scan everybody, pan scans for everyone, right? But the reality is we do a very limited, number of x-rays in the trauma bay. We'll do portable chest x-rays, portable pelvic films, and then maybe an isolated injury extremity film that allows us to look and see what the orthopedic injury is and determine whether or not initial splinting in that trauma bay needs to be done before we take them off to dispose of them for other testing. They may go to the operating room, which, and I don't have a percentage on what that number is. My gestalt is probably somewhere around, less than about like 15% of our patients are dispositioned to the operating room emergently. They may go to the ED proper for dispositioning and ultimately waiting for a bed, or unfortunately, they may go to the morgue. For those obviously that are going to the operating room, depending on the critical nature of their injuries and what their operative procedures are going to be, they may come to you all in the PACU when they are certainly done for final dispositioning to whatever bed that they are going to be transferred to for definitive care. All right, now look, I've talked to you a little bit about the trauma system of New Jersey. I've talked to you a lot about our trauma program and what makes up our trauma program and our patient population and trauma team activations and who's in the trauma bay and how the patient kind of flows through the trauma system. But let's not lose sight of the fact that we are a very good and very progressive trauma center here. We have a very good and very progressive trauma program management team. And we're great. Trauma at Joe's is great. And it's great for a variety of reasons. We have a very cool catchment area. We have a very urbanized inner city to suburban to rural catchment area. We can see gang violence and gunshot wounds from gang violence in one trauma bay, and we can be working on somebody who had a cow or a farm related injury in the bed next to them, right? We have a very busy emergency department, and because of the nature of our catchment, we get a lot of interesting injuries that come from a variety of areas. We have very, very positive relationships with our pre-hospital care providers around our region. And even those pre-hospital care providers that could take patients that are equidistant to other trauma centers will preferentially bring them to us because they look at St. Joe's as being really kind of the top of the crowd. All right. We have outstanding continuing education opportunities, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. We have a very high volume trauma service. We see about 2,000 trauma patients a year. So that certainly puts us in that. We see a decent percentage of penetrating trauma, and a lot of that is going to come to the operating room and then possibly come to you in the PACU. And then we do cutting edge resuscitative care. Many of our clinicians, myself included, attend national meetings, speak at national meetings, publish papers, and put into practice cutting edge trauma trends. So very, very, very proud of the system that we have and the care that we're able to provide our trauma patients. We also are blessed to have a lot of support administratively for a very, very robust continuing education system. So obviously you're taking part in that today as part of the requisite 4 hours of trauma education that you need per year. But don't lose sight of the fact that there's a lot of other trauma continuing education things that are out there. And we wholeheartedly encourage you to participate in any of these. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over these individualistically, but if there is any interest that you have in additional trauma continuing education, absolutely reach out to your designated trauma educator, or you can reach out to the trauma program office and chat with me or the trauma injury prevention coordinator and get more information. But what I will do is call your particular attention to this area here, the Trauma Center Association of America, or TCAA. TCAA is an organization that we belong to as an institution. We pay a lot of money to belong to this institution. And by belonging to this institution or this professional association, it gives you as a professional employee of St. Joe's the ability to access some phenomenal education. So the TCAA website, if you go to www.tcaa.org, you'll bring up their website, and then you can click on their education beacon, and you can see there's information tangential to their annual conference, courses that they run, online education, podcasts, and webinars that they publish. And as a St. Joe's employee, you have access to this. Now, in order to register, you go to the TCAA website. You would register yourself under the registration link, which would be a sign-in box that'll drop down, and then you'll pick new registration. You're going to want to enter your name and then your St. Joseph's email address, okay? Only your St. Joseph's email address will work. If you enter your Gmail, Yahoo, Hotmail, Google Mail, whatever else, AOL, for those of you who still got AOL stuff, that won't recognize it. It has to be a St. Joseph's email address. And then you will have access to probably over 100, if not more, different educational snippets that really run the cross-section of trauma care. It's not all about pre-hospital care. It's not all about, emergency care in the trauma resuscitation bay. It really is a good cross-section of trauma from pre-hospital through definitive care. So I wholeheartedly urge you to go online and take a look and take advantage of that. Whoops, sorry about that. Great, let's go back. All of the items that are up there that are educationally focused carry continuing education credit. So you can certainly go on and download a certificate when you're done as proof that you attended, if you need. And you also can use it for licensure if you have board certification that requires continuing education credit. That's all available as well. And then I'll put in a selfish plug for myself and the program that I run, which again is trauma education and community outreach. Is we're always looking for staff to come out and participate in our community outreach. We have three very active programs that are out there now. One is called Stop the Bleed. One is called the Safe Kids program, and the other one is called You Can Save a Life. These are three programs that we go out in the community, and we teach individuals from the lay public, high school kids, elementary school kids, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts. We go into churches, mosques, synagogues. We go into community groups. We go into community centers, and we teach a variety of different things from injury prevention to hands-on life-saving clinical skills like hands-only CPR, Narcan administration, and Stop the Bleed. So we're always looking for additional people who might want to come out and do it. And if you ever have any interest in doing that, please reach out to me and let me know. Finally, I leave you with this quote, and this is such a true quote. If you've seen one trauma patient, then you have seen one trauma patient. Don't get into the quagmire of thinking that all gunshot wounds are created equal, or all splenic injuries are created equal, or all liver lacerations are created equal, because they are not. So every patient is an individual, and every patient deserves the dignity of having a professional taking care for them that realizes that they are individuals and their injuries are unique to them, and the care that we can provide needs to be specific to the injuries and the signs and symptoms that they are displaying. And I'll finish off by this is my contact information, my email address here at the hospital. If you need any information at all, absolutely don't hesitate in reaching out to me. I'm always more than happy to chat with you and can provide you with any additional information you may need. Okay. And there's a reference list for today's talk. So again, appreciate your time today. I hope you found this talk to be very, very beneficial. Maybe not 100% in line with what you do on a day-to-day basis. And thank you for what you do up in the PACU. It's greatly appreciated. But it certainly is part of the system that you have chosen to work in that is a trauma center. So again, thanks for your time, and reach out if you have any questions.